particularly in this, what I still think of as slightly strange format. I'm definitely more used to giving these talks face to face, but just as I get familiar with Zoom, we announce a roadmap to get us out of here. I hopefully squeeze this one in before we go back to the traditional medium, but I think this will be a good thing for some time to come, the ease with which we can all get together and have these talks. So thanks again for allowing me to come and talk to you a little bit more about the Stone-curlew. I should say, normally when I give these talks, I do ask questions and I do try and get audience participation. So if I happen to fall back into that sort of routine automatically, then please forgive me. But as Barry said, if you do think of a question at any point during the talk, do just pop it in the chat bar. I will leave some time at the end to try and answer any questions that have been posed. But in the meantime, I'm afraid you're going to have to sit and listen to me whilst muted, as Barry's been very efficiently doing in the run up to this. So yes, so I'm Nick Tomalin. I am the Wessex Farm Projects Manager for the RSPB. I'm going to talk particularly tonight about the Stonecurlew project, something that I hope a lot of you will have heard about. Others may be wondering what on earth this is all about, particularly given the very cryptic photo that I've put as my opening slide there, that wonderful Stone-curlew eye. I've been very fortunate that I've worked on the project now for nearly 10 years. I actually returned, this is an area I grew up in, so I returned to Wiltshire and sort of resumed my my Wiltshire birding and was involved with this project. But when I was here as a sort of growing up, I never knew anything about Stone-curlew. I was completely unfamiliar with them. Even though I was a young birder, I just had no idea about this secretive and charismatic species. So it really is a great pleasure to work with them and now to be able to tell you a little bit more about them. If you don't know anything about them, I should start with a much better photo for you to actually see what they look like. It's a wonderfully daft looking bird. It's about the size of a crow, and it relies on this very cryptic camouflage, this plumage that keeps it well hidden, and that is a really important feature of Stone-curlew life. I will be returning to that time and time again tonight. They are a species that has evolved not to be seen, and they're very, very good at that. So they're generally active at dawn or dusk, and indeed through the night. And that large yellow eye that you saw in the first picture allows them to see well in the dark and allows them to operate under low light levels. It actually used to be thought that you could cure jaundice by looking a Stone-curlew in the eye, and there were people who had them captive in cages in order to dish out treatments to sufferers. But obviously we now know that eye helps them to forage at night and, as I said, in low light levels. They've got a short bill, quite a short stubby bill with yellow at the base. So most of the sort of things they're foraging for, things they're hunting for, will be surface feeders, bugs, beetles, spiders, things that they can pick off either at or very close to the surface. But I have actually seen them taking flying beetles out of the air, particularly sort of when there's a Maybug emergence. And they have this fantastic evocative call. So it's very similar to the common curlew, and that's how they get their name. It's that curly sound. If anyone has either spent evenings out looking for the birds or lives indeed near to where birds are holding territory, they will know that that's a really eerie, really evocative call of the Wessex countryside. But they're not related to the curlew, in fact. So they're the only member of their family found in the UK, that family being the thick-knees. And there's a number of thick-knee species globally, but they're the only one in the UK. And the thick-knee name comes from the Latin, which is Barinosodic namus, which translates as bull-nosed thick-knee, which is quite apt. But other good names for the Stone-curlew from sort of regional dialect include the wailing heath chicken, from the Brecks, and also the goggle-eyed plover, and both of which I think are brilliantly descriptive, if not overly complimentary to the bird. It's a migrant species. They arrive in, well, they arrive about now, actually. I made this presentation and made some notes last week saying they'll be here soon, but in the intervening few days, the first birds have been reported from a number of sites. There have been one or two in Hampshire. There's one or two at our reserve at Winterbourne Downs, and I actually saw my first one today. So they are coming back, and I guess this is not unusual. Late February is about the right sort of time, depending on weather conditions and temperature. but they will spend the whole summer here in the UK. So they will breed here, with the first eggs being laid generally in early April. They have a very long breeding season, so these birds can be double brooded. They can have 2 successful nesting attempts throughout the year. And we do certainly see some very late nesting attempts, so birds putting eggs down in August, and even chicks fledging as late as October sometimes. So it's a very, very long breeding season. And then as the summer wears on and more chicks have fledged and more pairs stop any breeding activity, they form these wonderful autumn roost flocks. So these pre-migration gatherings, which can be very large indeed. We've seen quite regularly over 50 birds.
Yeah, well, by the time they dress us up, we're on the 12th of April.
We've seen
there's going to be a lot of people walking about with fucking long hair, isn't there?
So a really, really good spectacle. If you do get the chance in autumn to go and see one of these roosts, it is quite an impressive sight to see these birds here. And when they leave us, they fly across Europe, and they tend to gather in winter spots for sort of north of the Med, or indeed south of the Med, North Africa and parts of southern Europe. And that's where they'll spend the winter, but not a very long winter. As I said, they could be here now. Some birds hang around until November, so it may only be a handful of months that they're not here. In terms of the population in the UK, the peak Stonecurlew population was probably no more than about 1,000 to 2,000 pairs at its height, and that's probably 100, 200 years ago. Mr. White of Selborne fame, a local son to many of you, no doubt, he recorded them quite frequently near Selborne, and despite other people mentioning them as rare, felt that they were relatively common. But in the last century, the population declined pretty quickly, and by the mid-1980s there were probably no more than about 170 pairs left in the UK, and the Wessex proportion of that was probably no more than 30 pairs, so a very low number that survived here in Wessex. And what you see now is the remnant populations that have survived. I mentioned Wessex, but the other population, probably some of you will have seen birds in East Anglia in the Brecklands area. They tend to hold about 2/3 of the UK population, and we have about 1/3, but we are doing our best to try and catch them in recent years. We're slowly upping our percentage of birds here in Wessex. But that range, even when it was widespread, it wouldn't have been across the whole of the UK. So they're a bird that associates very strongly with free draining soils. And so the distribution of Stonecurlews in the UK is very, very similar to the geological chalk map within the UK. So from the Dorset coast up into Wessex, up north into the Chilterns and beyond, and then into the Brecklands of East Anglia, and in fact even as far north as the Yorkshire or Lincolnshire wolds, there would have been Stonecurlews right the way through that sort of swathe of chalk that runs through from kind of southwest to northeast across the middle of England. Excuse me. I mentioned that they're tied to these areas. This is because of the geology and the free draining soils. They like drier areas, so it's not a wader that you would expect normally to see around water. Very unusual, in fact, to find Stonecurlews at or around wet areas. They like this really open landscape, and that links back to what I was saying about camouflage. They like to see predators approaching, so they rely on that camouflage. They don't want to have their line of sight obscured by long vegetation, by hedgerows or trees, or even to some extent fence lines and other things. So this landscape that you can see here is a classic sort of Stone-curlew landscape. It's a very open area, and this is in fact an area on the edge of Salisbury Plain. And the mix that you can see here is really, really good for Stonecurlews. So in the foreground, you have this stony fallow area, which is in fact a fallow plot, a ground nesting plot managed specifically for Stonecurlews. And that will be providing an area on which they can nest. But then you also have other areas in the landscape that will be supporting them. So in the distance, you can see some cropped areas. So spring crops could be suitable, game cover strips as well. And around that, you've got this fantastic sort of grassland area. And I say it's fantastic. Stonecurlews would at one point have been a bird of the open downland here in Wessex. But as our agricultural systems have changed, we've lost a lot of that very closely grazed, cropped, very short grassland, the sort of downland you might be familiar with. And a lot of what remains, particularly on Salisbury Plain, is much longer because of the military training and because of the lack of grazing. in some areas. So there's not many places now where the birds will continue to nest on a grassland setting itself, and even within the key areas, Salisbury Plain, Porton Down, they tend to be nesting on these fallow plots that are created for them. But that said, they will use the grasslands to forage. Obviously, it provides good areas of habitat for invertebrates, and so this mix that you can see in this picture is really, really suitable for Stone-curlew. Gave the game away a little bit quickly there. So if you didn't spot that arrow appearing, this is a Stone-curlew nest. So I was going to leave you as a little challenge just to try and find it. The nest itself is very, very unimpressive in structure, but ingenious in design. And it all links back to that word camouflage again. So the eggs are perfectly in keeping with their surroundings, and obviously designed not to be found. So this is obviously challenging for me and my team when we're out, because we have to find these nests and help protect them. So you can see my truck in the background. I would have been watching this pair, looking for birds, looking for territorial behaviour or courtship. They have this great courtship routine where the male will stalk around ahead of the female, cock its tail in the air and show off its orange underparts. And then when they find a place that they deem suitable for nesting, the male will sit down, it will scrape its legs out behind it, like it's paddling furiously, and then it'll move a few stones around and do a little bit of interior decoration, and call the female in to inspect the resulting scrape. And it really is just a scrape. There's nothing more to it than that. They'll lay 2 eggs. I've never seen 3. I've sometimes seen 1, but usually 2. And as I mentioned, these eggs are brilliantly camouflaged. They will rely on that camouflage during the incubation cycle. So they don't sit tight. As soon as that bird feels any sort of threat, it will get up off the nest and creep away from it, not drawing any attention to itself and trying to just sneak off. And then our challenge is to locate those eggs within that environment. So it's quite challenging. It relies on having good lines to walk in, and to be able to walk in a straight line. It's amazing how many people can't do that under pressure, particularly when you've got some very valuable eggs somewhere near your feet. So it does provide a challenge. I'm assuming you've all seen the nest now, so I will reveal, in case you hadn't, the 2 eggs are there. And all you can see, the only thing really to give you an indication is that slight area of sort of flattened soil, which just gives an indication where the bird has been sitting. Both birds will sit, both birds will incubate, male and female, and the eggs will take 28 days to hatch. So once we know there's a pair there, we can monitor that process through to hatch. When they do hatch, they become a Stone-curlew chick, and the chick will take another 6 weeks to fledge. The chicks themselves are also brilliantly camouflaged. You may not think it to look at this photo, but they do rely on that camouflage very heavily. In case you haven't spotted it, here it is. They will remain motionless if they feel threatened. So again, the parents will play no role in driving most predators away, unless they feel they are really close, in which case they can actively sort of hold their wings out and call and charge predators. But broadly speaking, their best defense is to leave the chicks well alone, and the chicks will lie motionless. Has its advantages and its disadvantages. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's a brilliant way to evade predators, but unfortunately from an agricultural perspective, it's a terrible way to evade tractors. So birds that have taken to nesting in vulnerable locations, vulnerable because they are arable fields or areas of land that need mechanical working still, those chicks, if they're not found ahead of that work taking place, they are more than likely to go underneath any tractor operations that are taking place. And that's where we come in. We help work with the landowners to try and prevent that from happening, both by locating nests and also, if necessary, by picking up chicks. And it's very handy for us that those chicks don't tend to move, because it means that when we are doing that work, we can literally go out and we can pick them up. This gives you an indication of that process that I've just described. So I've stolen this photo from my colleagues in the Brecks. It's a much more sort of Brecks landscape, so they tend to be more kind of vegetable farming rather than cereal farming in a lot of the fields where Stone-curlews are nesting. And it neatly illustrates the point that I was making. So ideally we would go out early in the season, we'll locate pairs, and we will keep tabs on them, watch their behavior, try and assess where they are in the breeding cycle, whether or not they've got eggs down, and if we think they have, then we'll try and locate those eggs. And here you can see 2 eggs on the ground in front of the tractor. So where we find these the nests ahead of time, we can then work with the landowners, work with the farmers and the tractor drivers and others, and we can mark those nests. So in the most part, the farmers are very good. They will obviously not want to try and go over those eggs if they know where they are, but we wouldn't expect them to be able to find them on their own. So we pop a couple of canes in the ground, and the farmer, the tractor, will drive around it in order to safeguard those eggs. And that's really critical early in the season for us to get out into the areas where it's likely that we're going to find nests in vulnerable places. One thing we do when we find those nests is we will weigh and measure the eggs. And the reason that we do that is that the data we collect from that allows us to calculate a hatch date. And it's pretty accurate. So enough work has been done to create an index, if you like, of how the size, the volume, the weight of the egg changes in relation to the size over the course of incubation. And so by having that data and by having a hatch date, we're better able to tailor the advice that we can give to the landowners. So for example, if they are intending to carry out work within the next week, we might ask them to delay until after hatching, or we might ask them to get on with it very quickly because it's far easier to avoid eggs than it is to avoid chicks. And it gives us a really good understanding, therefore, of how best to manage around those nests. Where it's not possible to manage around eggs, we will go in if necessary and pick up chicks. And this is a good example of that. So this is a situation where, unfortunately, the hatch date coincided pretty closely with the work that needed to be done, and the dates couldn't be changed. So we went in and lifted the chicks whilst this work was taking place. So I don't know how easy it is to see that, but at the bottom of this image is two-day-old Stonecurlew chicks. You can just see the sort of darker stripe across their grey backs. And we knew the hatch date for this, and we knew the work needed to take place. So I went in earlier in the morning before the farmer started his work, found the pair, located the chicks, and then we timed our activities so I could pick them up. And then the work took place, and we keep the chicks captive in a ringing bag so that they are protected and calm. And then once the work has taken place, we pop them back where we found them. Sometimes we'll move them a little way just to put them under some vegetation or somewhere where they're perhaps not quite so vulnerable or exposed. But broadly speaking, we put them back and we leave as quickly as possible, and the adults will come back in. So the adults won't abandon them in that sort of time frame. We try to restrict the time that we have them captive as much as we can, certainly try to keep it to no more than an hour, but the adults won't leave, they won't abandon, and they'll come back in, they'll call for the chicks, and then they'll go back and relocate them afterwards. And we've been doing this for a number of years, and it's very, very successful. So I should point out all of that work has to take place under license. These Stonecurlews are a protected species, so the whole team is licensed to carry out this activity. And it's been great working with the landowners. In some cases, they're very prepared to change their operations, to delay or alter their management in order to try and accommodate the breeding attempt. So it's a system that we've done for a number of years, and it's worked very, very well. But it is very intensive. So obviously we try and look for other ways in which we can manage for the species without requiring that sort of level of intensive team effort, if you like. So one method that we have come up with is to actually create fallow areas that are, if you like, sacrificial areas. So from an agricultural perspective, they don't grow anything. They're cultivated as fallow plots to create that bare surface that's very suitable for Stonecurlews. But they're then not cropped. So essentially it's land set aside specifically for ground nesting birds. And farmers can receive a payment for doing this through the agri-environment schemes that the government offers. So those schemes are available to all. Some of them are slightly more targeted, and we can work with Natural England to ensure that the areas where stone curlews are breeding, that landowners can access these schemes and these payments as well. The area itself tends to be about 2 hectares. The reason for that is that the research has shown that a stone curlew tends to need about 1 hectare for to have enough land to forage and to nest. And by having 2 hectares, we can manage it in halves so that we can try and accommodate that long breeding season that I mentioned at the start. So if a pair is nesting on one half, we can manage the other half to make it more suitable for future nesting attempts. And if a pair either fledges chicks or indeed fails, then we can do work on the other half again to try and re-establish suitable conditions to try and persuade those birds to nest again. And that's really important. Again, going back to the research, a lot of work was done in the 80s and 90s on stone curlew and showed that those later attempts are really critical in having a population that is either stable or increasing. So the productivity value that we're aiming for is 0.61 chicks per pair per year. And if we get to 0.61 chicks annually, the population should be stable. Anything above that, we hope to see it increase. But it is those later attempts that tend to push that productivity value up to the sort of area that we need it to be. So we can't just rely on first attempts, and these plots and the half management of these plots is one way in which we try to accommodate those later breeding attempts. The plot you can see is located mostly in a grass field, although also adjacent to arable, so they could be within grass, they could be within arable, but we try and locate them away from other forms of disturbance. Stone curlews are very sensitive species, very easily disturbed, so away from footpaths, away from main roads, away from power lines or tall trees or woodlands where you might expect to see some avian predators standing up or mammalian predator runs, those sort of things. So we try and site it in a way that reduces the pressure, the disturbance pressure on the birds, and certainly the predation pressure as well. This is a close-up of one of the plots. So I mentioned we do the half management where we can, and this neatly demonstrates that. The half on the right will have been managed more recently than the half on the left, which is starting to vegetate up. Generally speaking, the management that's most effective is cultivation, actually turning the soil again, because it creates that bare ground and it removes a lot of the sort of vegetation structure that might be otherwise unsuitable for stone curlews. But that's obviously risky in the sense that if there are eggs or chicks we don't know about, they could well be destroyed by that work. So we have to have a good handle on what's going on. Lower risk management is spraying. Because the sprays themselves don't have any impact on the chicks or the eggs. So it's much more unlikely that with spraying management you're going to actually run over the chicks. They tend to be, obviously it's a lower chance of that happening, and they tend to be okay with spraying so long as it's done at the right time. So spraying too late tends to leave a lot of standing dead vegetation that's not ideal, and spraying too early can be ineffective. So we try to fit around whatever the best system is for the farmer in question, but obviously sometimes we just have to go with whatever we can, whatever they can do. But that management is part of the prescription that they have if they've signed up to these schemes, and if they're getting a payment for that management. And we would also try to encourage them to incorporate a grass buffer like the one you can see here down the middle of the plot, but also around the edge. And that grass buffer will provide additional foraging habitat and additional cover for any chicks, and it means that if they do need to work whatever the crop is in the field, then you don't have a sort of danger zone along the edge where chicks might well run into the crop, into cover if they feel threatened, and then be in the way of any mechanical operations that are taking place. So hopefully this is the sort of management that we can persuade the landowners to do. And we do have a network of these plots across Wessex. We have a network of probably around 250 or so plots managed by some 300 or so sort of landowner and farming contacts that we have. And that relationship between conservation and agricultural colleagues is really critical to this. We couldn't have done any of the work that we have if it wasn't without the support of the local farmers and landowners, not just farmers and landowners, gamekeepers, tractor drivers, all sorts of other people contributing to this effort as well. And as I mentioned before, broadly speaking, the response from them has been fantastic. A lot of them have been working with Stonecurlew since the mid-1980s and probably earlier. So there's a lot of experience out there. And a number of them will actually send on their sightings to us, let us know when they need to carry out management, and help us to manage them as best we can around the farm operations, so it's not too much of an inconvenience. Hopefully most of these farmers are proud to have these birds rather than considering them a nuisance. It's not just the farmers. Of course, we work with other landowners, and that includes the MOD, particularly at Salisbury Plain and Porton Down. There are some reasonably unique challenges to field work on those sites. Obviously, they are active military areas, and gaining access and gaining permissions to work across them, and then adhering to the relevant health and safety can be quite challenging. But of course, it's the military presence that's actually maintained these areas as grasslands at a time when a lot of the other grasslands were being lost to arable farming, and when the Stonecurlew population was plummeting. So that's why Wessex still has birds. It's because of Salisbury Plain and Porton Down. And these areas are the last remaining huge, sort of the largest remaining swathes of chalk grassland that we have in northwest Europe. So Salisbury Plain is about 42,000 hectares. So it's a huge, huge site. And mostly, as I say, sort of chalk downland, chalk grassland, and it's protected, as is Porton Down, through various designations. So you've probably heard of SSSIs, Sites of Special Scientific Interest, and also Special Protection Areas, SPAs, and Special Areas of Conservation, SACs. These are European designations, which we very much hope will continue to be upheld post-Brexit. And what they do is essentially they highlight the significance of these areas for particular species and habitats, and they actually name those species and habitats. So Stone-curlew is a named feature of the SPA on both Salisbury Plain and Porton Down, and it means that the landowners have a responsibility to manage those features, to maintain those features, and that means that we can work very closely with the MOD to ensure that the population of Stone-curlews on these sites is well looked after. And they do. They have their contractors, Landmark, who do the work across a network of plots. They also have tenant farmers who also including plots across that landscape. But as I mentioned, very, very few places where Stonecurlews now nest directly on the downland. Probably really only on Porton Down now, and that's because the population of rabbits would have kept the downland very, very tightly cropped there. There's no grazing on Porton Down because of the chemical legacy left there, but the rabbit population keeps the grass relatively short. But even in the sort of 10 years that I've been around, there's quite significant fluctuations in the numbers of rabbits found on Porton Down, and that has had and is having an ongoing impact on Stonecurlews nesting directly on the downland there. This is a very rare sight indeed. This is a Stonecurlew field worker out of his vehicle. It doesn't happen that frequently because of the fact that Stonecurlews are so easily disturbed. We do by far the bulk of our work actually from a vehicle with a telescope mounted on the window. But every now and then we're allowed to hop out and use our legs. And this is some work that was happening a few years ago for vegetation surveys on plots to try and establish when was the best time to carry out in-season management. We have a network of staff and volunteers, quite a sizable team, working across the Wessex landscape, doing the fieldwork, doing the nest protection, liaising with landowners, and we've had a wonderful sort of support and response from volunteers who now carry out quite a lot of the monitoring on our behalf. I think there's a couple listening in, so apologies for all the things I'm getting wrong. You can question me on that later on. But the volunteer teams run their own areas pretty much as our staff would do as well, and that's allowed us to keep intensive monitoring going across the bulk of the Stonecurlew range. Not quite across the whole of it. It's become harder to do that as we've had more birds and less people, less resource, but certainly there are areas that we've been able to keep that intensive monitoring going because of the contribution that the volunteer team makes. It's been really, really helpful over a number of years. It's a very dedicated effort. We know that the plots themselves are delivering more than just Stone-curlew benefits. So the number of studies have shown the benefits to a range of other species. So like the brown hare that you can see here, brown hare will frequently lay up in plots, very often seen there, and will have their leverets in those areas as well, because of the weedy growth that's very suitable for providing protein-rich milk. So for a number of mammal species, they can be useful, but also for a whole range of invertebrates, things like bumblebees and butterflies, a lot more numerous on the plots than they are in the surrounding landscape. And that's perhaps not hugely surprising given the sort of tendency towards monoculture in a lot of our farmed landscape. It's not surprising that these areas of sort of heterogeneity provide a range of features from a range of different species, but it's really comforting to know that the work that we do and the advice that we give is also benefiting a whole host of other species, and not just animals either, so plant species in particular. I mentioned when we were looking at the plot photo, the grass buffer. One of the functions that the buffer actually can play is protecting the crop from any weed species on the plot, but also protecting those weed species from any spray drift, any sprays that are used on the crop. I quite often have conversations with landowners where they refer to them as weeds, and I refer to them as important and rare arable plants. Wessex is a hotspot for arable plants, and a lot of the work that we've been doing, particularly recently in partnership with Plant Life through the Colour in the Margins programme, has been to try and benefit arable plants in the Wessex area. Some of these plots and fields are of national or even international importance for some of these species. They are one of the fastest declining suites of species, assemblages of species. And we have a real urgency to try and protect them. And in terms of other birds that use them, I thought I'd show you a cute lapwing chick because I like this photo, and because we've done quite a lot of work, particularly in conjunction with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, who have been studying the productivity of lapwing on fallow plots. A bit of a mixed picture, but I'm sure a lot of you will be aware that the lapwing population has declined very significantly and continues to decline in most areas. Productivity on plots generally isn't quite high enough to keep the population stable or increasing, so we have seen further declines, and it's not particularly clear why that should be, but there are a few differences between Stone-curlew and lapwing that could hint at the reasons behind that. One is that lapwing chicks will feed themselves very quickly after they're hatched, and they will walk to an area of good forage. So if there isn't enough food on the plot, then those chicks will have to walk through a crop or through a hedgerow or over a field, or even over a road in some cases, and that exposes them to a greater level of risk and danger than they would if they simply stayed on the plot. But they need to do that to feed. So we try to locate our plots as close as we can to suitable areas of forage for lapwing, and that will help them with having to make that journey. That's slightly different for Stone-curlew because Stone-curlew adults can actually fly food in. They will fly elsewhere, forage, and then bring back food for the chicks. So there's a subtle difference between the two that makes quite a significant difference in terms of the location of the plots. The other thing with lapwings is they just simply don't seem to be as as savvy as Stone-curlew chicks. They don't tend to sit still when they're threatened quite as much, and so they're very easily spotted and very easily picked off. One of my colleagues refers to them as nature's little biscuits, which is probably quite true. They perfect size for a little snack for a hungry predator. We've also done some work with Stone-curlews in the past where we will process any chicks that we handle. So if we are picking them up for an intervention, or specifically, we will go to actually ring the birds as well in some cases. So we've taken bill measurements and weights to look at how well the birds are developing. And then we put rings on their legs, which allow us to identify each bird individually. So the usual sort of metal BTO ring with a unique number identifier, and then 3 colour rings in different locations so that that bird is essentially identifiable as an individual, if we can see it well enough in the field, which is obviously the biggest challenge. And that's given us some information about sort of the species ecology and how these birds interact with one another, where they move. So we know, for example, that the birds tend to be pretty site faithful. They do come back to an area close to where they were reared, particularly the males. We know that the birds are quite pair faithful as well. You often get the pair arriving back on the same plot, the same pair that were there the previous year. So they are reasonably faithful. And of course, it tells us a little bit more about their movement. So we know, for example, that there's not a lot of interchange between the birds in the Brecks and the birds in Wessex. We know a little bit about their movements sort of in the wintering areas. So a handful of recoveries from places like Morocco or southern Spain. And it also tells us how long they live, of course. So the longest, the oldest stone curlew that I'm aware of, I think the longevity record is about 22 years. We have a number of birds in the Wessex population that are teenagers now, very experienced birds. And in fact, one of the ones that you saw in the first photograph is 17 years old. That's probably the oldest bird I'm aware of in the Wessex population, and we know that it has returned every single year to breed on our reserve at Winterbourne Downs over the last sort of, I think, 12, 13 years. It's been there, having been ringed as a chick relatively locally. So we've had quite a lot of information from that in the past, but we're not continuing with ringing going forward for the time being because of the intensive nature of of doing it. It can be quite a lot of sort of effort to go out and do that across a wider scale, and we're not getting enough recoveries now to make it worth doing that. I mentioned the bird at Winterbourne Downs. This is Winterbourne Downs. I hope some of you might be familiar with it. It is in Wiltshire, so for ardent Hampshire birders, I apologise that it's not quite within your range. But if you do feel like trying to find a stone curlew, it is the place I would recommend. So it's a 300-hectare farm that we purchased in 2005, and since then we've been reverting it from largely arable to mostly grassland now, and in the process of doing that, we've implemented a number of fallow plots of our own. We've experimented a bit with different techniques, different management techniques, different types of plot as well, and things that we hope that we can then use sort of to wheel out to a wider audience, if you like. That said, this is not something that's that most people could replicate. It's not usually economically viable for farmers to recreate grassland on this scale, and we've had to change a lot of the systems of how it's managed. But it is now a fantastic haven for stone curlew and for all sorts of wildlife that relies on chalk downland. So stone curlew numbers here have increased as we've implemented habitat management and increased the number of plots. And last year, the productivity here was over 2. So very, very high productivity. I mentioned 0.61 is our target. They churned out over 15 chicks last year from, I think, 7 pairs. So really, really good rate of return. But it's not just about stone curlew, as I mentioned. Some of the other work that's gone on here will be benefiting a range of other species. And one of the really useful things is that we share a border with Porton Down. So this site is immediately between Porton Down and Salisbury Plain. And the fact that we have that close proximity to Porton Down means that we know that we can recreate habitat and that species will find it because they're moving out of Porton Down onto our adjacent fields. And in the last few years, we've now recorded Duke of Burgundy butterfly. Numbers of marsh fritillaries have gone up significantly. And we've also created 2 butterfly banks. These are very large chalk sculptures in the landscape, which provide suitable sheltered sort of slopes and suitable plugs of the relevant food plants for rare butterflies like little blues. So a lot of work has happened here over a number of years, and I hope, as I said, that you might have the opportunity to see this if you haven't already. And where we don't own land, we continue to work with landowners, not just as I've explained through the agri-environment schemes, but also we have a number of land management agreements with landowners. One near Stonehenge in the World Heritage Site, one on the edge of Porton Down, and also we work very closely with the Cholderton Estate. So a number of people who are doing similar habitat work to what you can see here at Winterbourne Downs. I'm always a bit wary of including a graph in a talk. I tend to try and avoid it if I can, but this one quite neatly illustrates the impact of all that work. So I spent most of the time explaining how we operate and what we've done over the years. And this is the impact that we've had. And you can see here from the early 90s, I've gone back as far as I can find data, a steady increase in the number of pairs. The blue line, if you can't read it, is all pairs, and the red line is the confirmed breeding pairs. So those numbers have continued to rise up until about 2011 when it peaked. And since then, there's been a much more variable state of affairs in the Stonecurlew population. And that's down to a number of things. Around the peak, at around sort of 2010, 2011, the UK population had actually increased to about 400 pairs, which was the target figure for the biodiversity action plan that used to exist for Stone-curlews. So we'd hit that target, but then a number of things have happened since that have been less straightforward. The first thing that happened, slightly awkwardly, is that I got the job in 2012. So that neat line that you can see ends with me arriving, and I hope it's not a reflection of my ability to do this work. But unfortunately, in 2012 and then in 2013, we had two very, very poor years for Stone-curlews. And in 2013 in particular, we had a very cold spring, a lot of frosty conditions late in March when birds had come back from migration and were unable to feed. And we actually found 7 bodies, so 7 dead Stone-curlew. To put that in context, we would normally not expect to find, or we might find 1 in a year on average, perhaps. But to find 7 in a year was unprecedented, and we had them post-mortemed. They were all underweight, and they also contained evidence of plastics actually within their stomachs, because they've been unable to find sufficient invertebrate food that they'd taken to trying to eat whatever they could find. So they were obviously starving because of the conditions. And we think in that year that the population declined by about 20%. So it knocked us back very considerably. And since then we've been trying to sort of redress that balance and to bring the population back to the levels where they were beforehand. Things since 2013 have been much more positive. So the productivity has been good. We've been above 0.61 every single year. And in fact, in 2019, we had a record productivity of 0.95 chicks per pair, which is absolutely fantastic. And so I suspect what this variability reflects is actually changes in our resourcing and in the areas that we're monitoring, rather than completely true numbers for Stone-curlews. So although there was a decline, I suspect we're now not finding as many birds as we did previously, partly because we haven't tried to monitor the whole population. I mentioned earlier that with less resources and more birds, it becomes harder to do that. So we have areas that are not proactively monitored, where we try and react when birds are reported. And partly because we've probably also to some extent reached a slight carrying capacity for some of the habitat. So we've engaged with a lot of landowners. It's hard to persuade them to put in more plots or to do more work than they already are. And so to some extent, we've sort of, through working across the area that we are, it's quite hard to keep that figure rising. But obviously we don't want to see more declines, and so we will monitor this going forward as best we can. I haven't put in the figures for 2020, incidentally, because you no doubt, like everyone else, we were impacted by COVID. We were furloughed for a couple of months, so we don't have a full set of data for 2020. I probably will put it in time, and it will look like 2001 when foot and mouth had the same impact on fieldwork. We weren't able to get out at that point, so you see a dip there just for a year. So hopefully we'll come back this year and the figures will be going up again. As I said, assuming we can get out and do all the work that we're planning on doing, because obviously we still have some way to go with the pandemic. So that gives you, I hope, a reasonably interesting but still quite brief oversight of all the work that's gone on in 35 years for this species. But it's not done, as you can see. There's still things that we need to try and achieve. I think quite critically, we've created a system where we know how to manage for Stone-curlew, but it requires people at every stage. So it requires farmers to put in the plots, it requires financial support for those plots, and it requires conservationists on the ground surveying and monitoring in order to work with the landowners to protect them. So we've not yet created a sort of system where we can say Stonecurlew is truly sustainable from an ecological perspective, and that will be the focus of work in the coming years, to try and find a way to move the sort of the intensity of the monitoring back a step into a place where we feel comfortable that the Stonecurlews are still receiving enough support in the right at the right stages and in the right ways to keep that population and that productivity figure where it needs to be. But as I said, it is that relationship between the conservationists and the landowners and the farmers that is really critical to this. And I hope that will continue to be the case despite Brexit, despite challenges going forward. So I'm hoping to try and work on a new strategy for Stonecurlew in the coming years. But for now, it is a species that is conservation dependent, and it's a species that will rely on us, I think, for some time to come. So thank you ever so much for listening. I hope that's covered some of the questions perhaps that came in, but I would be more than happy to talk more widely or to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much for that. Really, really interesting, fascinating. On obviously a bird that we don't see too often over across the county line. So thanks very much for sharing what you have tonight, and fascinating to follow the journey that you've just panned out. I'm sure it had nothing to do with your arrival in 2012. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. But good to hear about the optimism you have in terms of those numbers climbing again. I'm going to ask Keith to unmute. I know Keith was just keen to say a few words. There were one or two questions that also were posted around Hampshire. Maybe the two of you could do a double act on this one. Keith, I'll let you to allow you a second to unmute yourself, and maybe perhaps the two of you might just want to do a double act on Hampshire.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Barry. Great talk, Nick. The question I'm always being asked by people is, where can you go to see Stonecurlews in Hampshire? And as you mentioned, they are very good at hiding themselves, and we don't publicise where to go. But what we will be doing, once we're allowed to and do outings again, we'll be doing an outing to Tidgrove Warren up in the northern part of Hampshire. We'll have to limit the numbers probably a little bit, but maybe take 20 or 30 people. We've done it twice before, really popular walk, and people get to see Stonecurlews on that walk. We'll probably do it in August if we can, but who knows what's going to happen this year. But next year we definitely will. Other thing, at the risk of self-promotion, this is Birdwatch magazine, which came out yesterday. Highly recommend the magazine. But all just to say, there's an article in it, a 3-page article, all about the Stonecurlew. Here it is, Stonecurlew in Hampshire, which you may want to have a read of. An article that I put together for the magazine, so have a read of that. That was all I was going to say initially, anyway. Yeah, we can do a double header on the questions if you like.
There you go. Thanks.
Should we start with the one about where to see them? I think you've said it really. It's not easy to see them in Hampshire because most of the sites in Hampshire are private farmland sites. So we obviously can't recommend that you go looking for them. You'll possibly be aware of where some of them are. And there are some rights of way, but it's not easy, and you could be causing disturbance, particularly during the breeding season. So I would recommend Winterbourne Downs. It is designed for that. There are viewing screens that look out onto Stonecurlew plots, so you can get a reasonably good view. I say a reasonably good view, as good a view as anyone can ever get of a Stonecurlew, because you'll still need a telescope, and you'll still be probably, unless you're very lucky, you'll be scouting around for a while to find it. But that is Stonecurlew wherever you look for them. Equally, if you do have events that you can run that are controlled events with landowner permission and through Hos and through Keith, then that's great too, because obviously that's been managed in a way that will ensure that there's no impact on the birds. So generally speaking, I would say that's your best bet. But that is better than I used to say, which was go to Weeting Heath in the Brecks. So we do at least now have a closer place for you to get to, even if lockdown restrictions might keep you from getting there right now. Somebody asked about Martin Down as well, I think. Prior to
right, Nick. Yeah, there's one on Martin Down.
Yeah, so Martin Down's an interesting one. Martin Down had birds up until I think about 2008, give or take, and there's been nothing confirmed there since, but regular reports. So it's an area that we can no longer proactively monitor because there's just not been recent enough regular sightings to be able to get down there and do that monitoring. But we do get those reports come in, and we try to follow them up where we can. All too often they come in sort of in autumn, well beyond the time when we could usefully have found them. But it's still a needle in a haystack job. So there might be odd birds in the area around there, not just on Martin Down, but in some of the farmland potentially. And there certainly would be birds passing through that area. So obviously birds at this time of year that turn up in places on their way north or wherever it is they're making their way to. But the issue I think with Martin Down is probably one of recreational disturbance. As the site has become more heavily used, the bird that was actually known to us, so it was an individual, it was a ringed bird, a ringed female, and it was there for about 8 or 10 years, I think, and probably grew accustomed to that level of disturbance as it changed. And once that bird failed to come back, we've not had anything there regularly since. So sadly, it's unlikely that there's very much chance of seeing them at Martin Down now.
Nick, there was one other question I think that was posted. The question was about whether the adult birds wait for the juveniles before heading off for the wintering grounds. Do they hang back, or do they leave them to their own devices?
It's a good question, and I don't have an absolute answer for you on that. So I don't know if anyone else who's been doing their research wants to jump in. But what I would say is I suspect that a lot of the birds broadly go around the same time in groups, or in small groups. I don't know if they're family groups particularly, but given that these birds are double brooded, potentially, your first fledging dates will be mid-June. If a bird is laid early in April, you could have birds fledging in mid-June, and those birds would actually be driven away from the territory by the parents in order for them to re-nest. So it could be that they are no longer a family from only a few days after those birds have fledged. We would tend to expect it to be about a week before the birds would re-nest, so they might drive those birds off very quickly. Conversely, you might have birds that have fledged in late September, October, who are migrating very, very quickly. So there might be some family groups where those birds have remained together because they either bred recently or have stayed in the same area. Or you might have a situation where birds that fledged 3 or 4 months ago have actually gone off themselves and found a different roost, or might have migrated earlier. There is some very limited evidence that young Stonecurlew might undertake their own journeys every now and then straight away after fledging in peculiar ways. So we have had a bird that we know we ringed and then fledged from Salisbury Plain, turned up in Cheshire within a week of fledging, and stayed there a bit, and then went to Kent and stayed there a bit, and then wasn't seen again. We've also had a bird that we ringed on the plain that turned up at Portland Bill in July. So there's this sort of slight hint that 1 or 2 birds that have fledged feel this urge to undertake some form of trip pretty quickly. But broadly speaking, most of them would stick around, and we would see them as ringed, fledged young through the autumn roosts. I don't know if Keith's read anything else to add to that, or?
No, other than I think there's some theory now that this is actually an example of reverse migration, the kind of thing you see in yellow-browed warblers, where we get lots of young yellow-browed warblers in October. It could be the same sort of thing with Stonecurlews. A small percentage of the population, certainly a tiny population, get everything wrong, go the wrong direction, and don't know left from right, because there's people who do that too. I was just going to say, Nick, you may remember I had one pair which nested on one of our plots, and I was watching the male and female. They'd fledged their young, and I saw one of the fledged chicks with the pair, and I suddenly saw what I presumed to be the female sit down, and I thought, well, that's really weird. Why is she sitting down? And eventually I went and checked it out, and she already had another set of eggs. So she had, the male was looking after the chick from the first brood, and the female was already on eggs on the second brood. Amazing. They don't waste time.
A couple more questions, we get close to the hour. There was one question about their breeding habit, Nick. The question was about, do we know how that breeding, the specialist breeding habit evolved over time? I mean, obviously this is going back a long time, but do we have any insights to how their specific breeding has evolved over the years? Do we have any historical view?
I guess it might be one Keith's done a lot more research onto this than I have, but my opinion is that when they were on grasslands, obviously they weren't this wasn't a brown bird that looks perfect for arable, soil and stones sitting in the middle of a grass field. This would have been a bird that was well camouflaged in a chalky landscape, essentially, when there was a much chalkier landscape available, be it rabbit burrows or bits that have been sort of scratched up or churned up. So they would seek out the areas that were disturbed, if you like, disturbed ground, and they still do. So on Salisbury Plain, they nest on the edge of tank tracks sometimes, because that's the suitable ground that's been created. And then what's happened, obviously, we've lost those grasslands and they've been forced onto arable. It kind of suits them in many ways. They are brilliantly well camouflaged to that stony, chalky, flinty ground, and even bits of stubble and other things that look like the wing bar and other features to help camouflage them further. So that would be my assessment of it. Any thoughts, Keith?
Yep, I agree totally, Nick. I mean, if you look back to where I saw my very first Stone-curlew in the 1970s, was Weeting Heath, which was one of the biggest rabbit warrens in the whole country. In fact, one of the houses down the road is called Warrener's Cottage at Weeting. Tidgrove Warren, where we would regularly see the birds on the hoss walks. Again, formerly, before it was a farm, it was indeed a huge rabbit warren. And if you look at some of the other places that you and I know about, look at the names. They got the name Warren in there a lot of rabbit warrens.
Right, guys, I think we're just coming up to the hour. There was a historical question. I'll pose it just around the reference to Gilbert White you posed, Nick, earlier on. I guess it's a long time since that we had the Stone-curlew around back in Gilbert White's days. I guess long lost us, I'm afraid, I guess. Long left us, rather.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any birds that far east, as it were. So the birds that the Hampshire team are monitoring, broadly speaking, are no further east than the Test, I would say. And then going north, obviously the population up closer to Hannington, but nothing that far that we're aware of. That's not to say that there couldn't be the odd bird. And I would hope that somebody finding one, be it a birder or a landowner, might be sufficiently intrigued to get in touch, and we could always follow that up if they did.
Super. Nick, we're just about on the hour, so spot on tonight. Thank you so much again. It's been a fascinating insight to what you shared and obviously what you're focused on. A personal, on behalf of everyone's, good luck with the personal event that's about to happen in the near term. No one will know, but Nick and his wife are expecting their second child imminently. Just trying to cram out 1 or 2 talks in before that key event. So thank you for spending tonight with us, Nick. Very much appreciated.
I should say, if anyone is tempted to join the Wiltshire Ornithological Society talk tomorrow, you will be hearing this all again. So probably take a night off if you were thinking of doing that.
Nick, thanks again so very much. Wish you both all the very best in the coming weeks with your personal event. Keith, thanks for adding the comments as well, and thanks for all of you for joining tonight's talk. We'll be posting the forthcoming talks very shortly, so look out for those. So as ever, good evening to you all. Take care of yourselves, and final time, Nick, thanks very much for joining us tonight and giving us a fantastic and interesting talk.
Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone.
Have a good night all.
Good night, Nick.
And a very big thank you also to you, Barry, and to Nicola for doing all the admin for tonight's talk. Much appreciated.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.